Hey everyone. So, we are going to move on from satire and instead go to memoir. And we are going to be reading The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. I read this book when I was in high school, my second year, and I really liked it. It was one of the only things I actually liked reading that year. I, for some reason, didn't like American literature very much, but it's a really amazing book. It's about a woman and her experience growing up and her family. And I hope you also enjoy it. I'm going to start reading now. A woman on the street. I was sitting in a taxi wondering if I had overdressed for the evening when I looked out the window and saw Mom rooting through a dumpster. It was just after dark. A blustery March wind whipped the steam coming out of the manholes, and people hurried along the sidewalks with their collars turned up. I was stuck in traffic 2 blocks from the party where I was heading. Mom stood 15 feet away. She had tied rags around her shoulders to keep out the spring chill and was picking through the trash while her dog, a black and white terrier mix, played at her feet. Mom's gestures were all familiar, the way she tilted her head and thrust out her lower lip when studying items of potential value that she'd hoisted out of the dumpster, the way her eyes widened with childish glee when she found something she liked. Her long hair was streaked with gray, tangled and matted. Her eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, but still she reminded me of the mom she'd been when I was a kid, swan diving off cliffs and painting in the desert and reading Shakespeare aloud. Her cheekbones were still high and strong, but the skin was parched and ruddy from all those winters and summers exposed to the elements. To the people walking by, she probably looked like any of the thousands of homeless people in New York City. So, what we're seeing here is that Jeanette is thinking about her mother and their childhood, and her childhood with her mother. And what we can tell from her swan diving off of cliffs, I mean, that's dangerous. Painting in the desert, reading Shakespeare aloud. So she's intelligent, reading Shakespeare. Shakespeare's no easy thing to understand. She's very creative because she's a painter, and she's adventurous because she was swan diving off of cliffs. So that's important. We see a character here of the mother, beyond her just rooting through a dumpster, and it's important that we know these other things about her too. It had been months since I laid eyes on Mom, and when she looked up, I was overcome with panic that she'd see me and call out my name, and that someone on the way to the same party would spot us together, and Mom would introduce herself, and my secret would be out. I slid down in the seat and asked the driver to turn around and take me home to Park Avenue. The taxi pulled up in front of my building, the doorman held the door for me, and the elevator man took me up to my floor. My husband was working late, as he did most nights, and the apartment was silent except for the click of my heels on the polished wood floor. I was still rattled from seeing Mom, the unexpectedness of coming across her, the sight of her rooting happily through the dumpster. I put some Vivaldi on, hoping the music would settle me down. And so, what I want you to notice is how Jeanette Walls lives. She lives in this apartment. It has polished floors. She wears stylish clothes. She has heels. There was a doorman to her apartment building. She took an elevator up. Her mother and her father clearly do not live this way. They don't have the money to have the kind of apartment she has in New York City. I look around the room. There were the turn of the century bronze and silver vases and the old books with worn leather spines that I'd collected at flea markets. There were the Georgian maps I'd framed, the Persian rugs, and the overstuffed leather armchair I liked to sink into at the end of the day. I'd tried to make a home for myself here, tried to turn the apartment into the sort of place where the person I wanted to be would live, but I could never enjoy the room without worrying about Mom and Dad huddled on a sidewalk grate somewhere. I fretted about them, but I was embarrassed by them too, and ashamed of myself for wearing pearls and living on Park Avenue while my parents were busy keeping warm and finding something to eat. So we see more of the things that she has. She has fancy things. She has expensive rugs. She has maps that she's framed. She has a leather armchair. Leather is really expensive. And so we're seeing how her parents live in poverty. They're huddled on a street corner together. They might not even, we don't know yet whether or not they have a place to live, but they don't have any money. And Jeanette clearly does at this point. So what this shows us so far is that Jeanette grew up in poverty. She didn't have very much money. A little more than her parents have right now. They had, because I've read this book before, but not a whole lot more. But she has gotten out of that, and she wants to help her parents, but doesn't know how. What could I do? I tried to help them countless times, but Dad would insist they didn't need anything, and Mom would ask for something silly like a perfume atomizer or a membership in a health club. They said that they were living the way they wanted to. After ducking down in the taxi so Mom wouldn't see me, I hated myself, hated my antiques, my clothes, and my apartment. I had to do something. So I called a friend of Mom's and left a message. It was our system of staying in touch. It always took Mom a few days to get back to me, but when I heard from her, she sounded, as always, cheerful and casual, as though we'd had lunch the day before. I told her I wanted to see her and suggested she drop by the apartment, but she wanted to go to a restaurant. She loved eating out, so we agreed to meet for lunch at her favorite Chinese restaurant. Mom was sitting at a booth studying the menu. When I arrived, she'd made an effort to fix herself up. She wore a bulky gray sweater with only a few light stains and black leather men's shoes. She'd washed her face, but her neck and temples were still dark with grime. She waved enthusiastically when she saw me. "It's my baby girl," she called out. I kissed her cheek. Mom had dumped all the plastic packets of soy sauce and duck sauce and hot and spicy mustard from the table into her purse. Now she emptied a wooden bowl of dried noodles into it as well. "A little snack for later on," she explained. We ordered. Mom chose the seafood delight. "You know how I love my seafood," she said. She started talking about Picasso. She'd seen a retrospective of his work and decided he was hugely overrated. All the Cubist stuff was gimmicky, as far as she was concerned. He hadn't really done anything worthwhile after his Rose period. So again, we see her intelligence. We see that Jeanette is trying to push back against the idea that poverty has anything to do with intelligence. Her mother knows about Picasso, talks about Cubism, and uses words like gimmicky and things like that, and knows things about history with art. So we know that her mother is very intelligent, but she still lives in poverty. And I think that's a really important thing to know with this book. "I'm worried about you," I said. "Tell me what I can do to help." Her smile faded. "What makes you think I need your help?" "I'm not rich," I said, "but I have some money. Tell me what it is you need." She thought for a moment. "I could use an electrolysis treatment." "Be serious." "I am serious. If a woman looks good, she feels good." "Come on, Mom." I felt my shoulders tightening up the way they invariably did during these conversations. "I'm talking about something that could help you change your life, make it better." "You want to help me change my life?" Mom asked. "I'm fine. You're the one who needs help. Your values are all confused." "Mom, I saw you picking through the trash in the East Village a few days ago." "Well, people in this country are too wasteful. It's my way of recycling." She took a bite of her seafood delight. "Why didn't you say hello?" "I was too ashamed, Mom. I hid." Mom pointed her chopsticks at me. "You see," she said, "right there. That's exactly what I'm saying. You're way too easily embarrassed. Your father and I are who we are. Accept it." "And what am I supposed to tell people about my parents?" "Just tell the truth," Mom said. "That's simple enough." So that's important. She's embarrassed by her parents and admits that she's embarrassed by her parents. So now we have chapter 2, the desert. I was on fire is the first line. It's my earliest memory. I was 3 years old, and we were living in a trailer park in a southern Arizona town whose name I never knew. I was standing on a chair in front of the stove, wearing a pink dress my grandmother had bought for me. Pink was my favorite color. The dress's skirt stuck out like a tutu, and I liked to spin around in front of the mirror, thinking I looked like a ballerina. But at that moment, I was wearing the dress to cook hot dogs, watching them swell and bob in the boiling water as the late morning sunlight filtered in through the trailer's small kitchenette window. Okay, I want to point out that she is cooking hot dogs and she is 3 years old. I hope none of you were cooking your own meals at 3 years old, but Jeanette was. I could hear Mom in the next room singing while she worked on one of her paintings. Juju, our black mutt, was watching me. And a mutt, that's a dog, so probably a lab mix. I stabbed one of the hot dogs with a fork and bent over and offered it to him. The wiener was hot, so Juju looked at it tentatively, but when I stood up and started stirring the hot dogs again, I felt a blaze of heat on my right side. I turned to see where it was coming from and realized my dress was on fire. Frozen with fear, I watched the yellow-white flames make a ragged brown line up the pink fabric of my skirt and climb my stomach. Then the flames leaped up, reaching my face. I screamed, I smelled the burning, and heard a horrible crackling as the fire singed my hair and eyelashes. Juju was barking. I screamed again. Mom ran into the room. "Mommy, help me," I shrieked. I was still standing on the chair, swatting at the fire with the fork I had been using to stir the hot dogs. Mom ran out of the room and came back with one of the army surplus blankets I hated because the wool was so scratchy. She threw the blanket around me to smother the flames. Dad had gone off in the car, so Mom grabbed me and my younger brother, Brian, and hurried over to the trailer next to ours. The woman who lived there was hanging her laundry on the clothesline. She had clothespins in her mouth. Mom, in an unnaturally calm voice, explained what had happened and asked if we could please have a ride to the hospital. The woman dropped her clothespins and laundry right there in the dirt, and without saying anything ran for her car. When we got to the hospital, nurses put me on a stretcher. They talked in loud, worried whispers while they cut off what was left of my fancy pink dress with a pair of shiny scissors. Then they picked me up, laid me flat on a big metal bed piled with ice cubes, and spread some of the ice over my body. A doctor with silver hair and black-rimmed glasses led my mother out of the room. As they left, I heard him telling her that it was very serious. The nurses remained behind, hovering over me. I could tell I was causing a big fuss, and I stayed quiet. One of them squeezed my hand and told me I was going to be okay. Okay, so we have some information from here. The first is the family lives in a trailer park, and they only have one car, and they didn't call an ambulance, which I think is important. Ambulances cost a lot of money. It's like $120 if you call an ambulance. It might be more if you don't have insurance. And so they ended up driving to the hospital instead of calling an ambulance. So that's also important. That's something that a lot of people will do. Like they'll get really badly injured and then they know that they can't afford an ambulance. So then they'll try to take an Uber or like they'll try to drive themselves. My sister works in trauma and there was a woman who was shot and my sister said she drove herself to the hospital and my sister said she had no idea how she did that. So that's an important thing to know with this as well, and an important detail. Sometimes the lack of a detail shows just as much as a detail, like the fact that they didn't call an ambulance probably means they couldn't afford one. Okay. I know, I said, but if I'm not, that's okay too. The nurse squeezed my hand again and bit her lower lip. The room was small and white with bright lights and metal cabinets. I stared for a while at the rows of tiny dots in the ceiling panels. Ice cubes covered my stomach and ribs and pressed up against my cheeks. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small, grimy hand reach up a few inches from my face and grab a handful of ice cubes. I heard a loud crunching sound and looked down. It was Brian, eating the ice. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. They took patches of skin from my upper thigh and put them over the most badly burned parts of my stomach, ribs, and chest. They said it was called a skin graft. When they were finished, they wrapped my entire right side in bandages. Okay, so that is something that you do if you get third-degree burns. So, like a first-degree burn, like I've had first-degree burns, where you might like burn yourself on something, your skin turns red and it heals. A second degree burn is when your skin blisters, and a third degree burn at its worst will turn your skin black. And so they did a skin graft and they took skin from her thigh so that they could replace the skin that was burned that badly. Because when skin's burned that badly, it doesn't heal that well. And honestly, with the amount of her body that was burned on top of her age, because remember, she's 3 years old, so she's pretty small. She is actually very lucky to be alive with how much of her stomach and chest were burned. "Look, I'm a half mummy," I said to one of the nurses. She smiled and put my arm in a sling and attached it to a headboard so I couldn't move it. The nurses and doctors kept asking me questions. How did you get burned? Have your parents ever hurt you? Why do you have all these bruises and cuts? My parents never hurt me, I said. I got the cuts and bruises playing outside and the burns from cooking hot dogs. They asked what I was doing cooking hot dogs by myself at the age of 3. It was easy, I said. You just put the hot dogs in the water and boil them. It wasn't like there was some complicated recipe that you had to be old enough to follow. The pan was too heavy for me to lift when it was full of water, so I'd put a chair next to the sink, climb up and fill a glass, then stand on a chair by the stove and pour the water into the pan. I did that over and over again until the pan held enough water. Then I'd turn on the stove, and when the water was boiling, I'd drop in the hot dogs. Mom says I'm mature for my age, I told them, and she lets me cook for myself a lot. So that's a huge red flag right there. To have a 3-year-old talking about that, yeah, that's a red flag. That's really bad. 2 nurses looked at each other, and one of them wrote something down on a clipboard. And obviously the nurses think that's bad too, otherwise they would not react that way. I asked what was wrong. Nothing, they said. Nothing. Every couple of days, the nurses changed the bandages. They would put the used bandages off to the side, wadded and covered with smears of blood and yellow stuff and little pieces of burned skin. Then they'd apply another bandage, a big gauzy cloth, to the burns. At night, I would run my left hand over the rough, scabby surface of the skin that wasn't covered by the bandage. Sometimes I'd peel off scabs. The nurses had told me not to, but I couldn't resist pulling on them real slow to see how big a scab I could get loose. Once I had a couple of them free, I'd pretend they were talking to each other in cheeping voices. It's amazing what children do, even in the worst of circumstances. The hospital was clean and shiny. Everything was white. The walls and sheets and nurses' uniforms or silver, the beds and trays and medical instruments. Everyone spoke in polite, calm voices. It was so hushed you could hear the nurses' rubber-soled shoes squeaking all the way down the hall. I wasn't used to quiet and order, and I liked it. So that's another red flag to me, that she is enjoying being in the hospital instead of being at home. That isn't something that most people would enjoy. I also liked it that I had my own room, since in the trailer I shared one with my brother and my sister. My hospital room even had its very own television set up on the wall. We didn't have a TV at home, so I watched it a lot. Red Buttons and Lucille Ball were my favorites. The nurses and doctors always asked how I was feeling and if I was hungry or needed anything. The nurses brought me delicious meal 3 times a day, with fruit cocktail or jello for dessert, and changed the sheets even if they still looked clean. Sometimes I read to them and they told me I was very smart and could read as well as a 6-year-old. So this is also important the fact that Jeanette feels it's important to mention that she got 3 meals a day shows that she probably didn't get 3 meals a day when she was at home. And change the sheets even if they still looked clean as well. Like that makes me think that she sleeps in dirty sheets a lot at home. One day, a nurse with wavy yellow hair and blue eye makeup was chewing on something. I asked her what it was, and she told me it was chewing gum. I had never heard of chewing gum, so she went out and got me a whole pack. I pulled out a stick, took off the white paper and the shiny silver foil under it, and studied the powdery, putty-colored gum. I put it in my mouth and was stunned by the sharp sweetness. "It's really good," I said. "Chew on it, but don't swallow it," the nurse said with a laugh. She smiled real big and brought in other nurses so they could watch me chew my first ever piece of gum. When she brought me lunch, she told me I had to take out my chewing gum, but she said not to worry because I could have a new stick after eating. If I finished the pack, she would buy me another. That was the thing about the hospital. You never had to worry about running out of stuff like food or ice or even chewing gum. I would have been happy staying in that hospital forever. When my family came to visit, their arguing and laughing and singing and shouting echoed through the quiet halls. The nurses made shushing noises, and Mom and Dad and Lori and Brian lowered their voices for a few minutes. Then they would slowly grow loud again. Everyone always turned and stared at Dad. I couldn't figure out whether it was because he was so handsome or because he called people partner and Goomba and threw his head back when he laughed. So the family is loud. They're kind of obnoxious. And yeah, but in the hospital, Jeanette didn't feel like she ever had to worry about anything. At 3 years old, she's worried about food and money and things like that. Or like running out of things. One day, Dad leaned over my bed and asked if the nurses and doctors were treating me okay. If they were not, he said, he would kick some asses. I told Dad how nice and friendly everyone was. "Well, of course they are," he said. "They know you're Rex Walls' daughter." When Mom wanted to know what it was the doctors and nurses were doing that was so nice, I told her about the chewing gum. "Ugh," she said. She disapproved of chewing gum. She went on. "It was a disgusting, low-class habit, and the nurse should have consulted her before encouraging me in such vulgar behavior. She said she was going to give that woman a piece of her mind, by golly. After all," Mom said, "I am your mother, and I should have a say in how you're raised." Okay, that's where I'm gonna stop for today. Because I know you still have your satire projects that you're working on. I'm going to have a couple of questions about this section that I want you to answer, but it's not going to be a full, like, one-page worksheet. It might just be, like, write a couple of lines, quote something, because I want you to be able to finish your satire projects this week. But I also wanted to start The Glass Castle. I really like this book, and I think it's written in a way that's pretty simple, and hopefully the language is easy for you all. If there are any words you don't know and want me to define, please let me know. Okay, I'll see y'all later.